Prison camps were supposed to be harsh. But German POWs got a shock. Ice cream and Coca-Cola were on the menu. This sounds crazy, but it's true. American prison camps during World War II were surprisingly comfortable. Many people struggle to understand how this was possible. The war was brutal and prisoners of war were often treated poorly. But the Americans did things differently. They believed in treating prisoners with respect and kindness, even if they were enemies. This approach raised a lot of questions. How could the Americans afford to be so generous? What was the point of giving prisoners luxuries like ice cream and Coca-Cola? You're about to discover the fascinating story behind this unusual treatment. You'll learn how the Americans used prisoner of war camps as a tool for winning the war, not just for punishing the enemy. You'll see how this approach affected the prisoners and the outcome of the war. You'll also find out what life was like in these camps, and how the prisoners reacted to their unexpected comforts. We'll take a closer look at the history of American prisoner of war camps, and explore the reasons behind this unusual approach. We'll examine the impact on the prisoners and how it influenced the course of the war. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the most surprising and intriguing stories from history. If you're curious about the past and want to learn more, consider subscribing for new videos every week. Life in a prison camp doesn't exactly scream luxury. But for German POWs in American camps during World War II, things were a little different. They got a taste of something that would change their perspective on the enemy: ice cream and Coca-Cola. It sounds crazy, but these small pleasures had a huge impact on the prisoners. One particular story that stands out is of a German soldier named Hans. Hans was captured by American forces in 1944 and sent to a prison camp in the United States. At first, he was skeptical of the Americans and their intentions. But one day, while working in the camp's kitchen, Hans saw something that made his eyes widen: a big old ice cream machine. The Americans were making ice cream for the prisoners. Hans couldn't believe it. In Germany, ice cream was a rare treat, and here he was, getting it for free in a prison camp. The ice cream was just the beginning. Hans soon discovered that the Americans were also providing Coca-Cola to the prisoners. This was a drink that Hans had only heard of before, and he was excited to try it. The first sip was like nothing he had ever tasted before. It was sweet, fizzy, and refreshing. Hans was hooked. He started looking forward to the daily Coca-Cola ration, and it became a highlight of his day. But what's really interesting is how these small pleasures affected Hans and the other prisoners. They started to see the Americans in a different light. They realized that their captors weren't just enemy soldiers, but human beings who were capable of kindness and generosity. The ice cream and Coca-Cola became a symbol of this newfound understanding. It showed the prisoners that even in the midst of war, there was still room for compassion and humanity. This experience had a profound impact on Hans. He started to question his own biases and prejudices against the Americans. He realized that they weren't just a faceless enemy, but individuals with their own stories and motivations. This newfound understanding helped Hans to cope with the difficulties of prison life. He formed friendships with some of the American guards and even learned a few words of English. The story of Hans and the other German POWs is a powerful reminder of the impact that small acts of kindness can have. It shows that even in the most unlikely of places, human connection and compassion can thrive. And it's this idea that we'll explore further in the next section, where we'll look at how the Americans used food and other comforts to build relationships with their prisoners, and what this reveals about the psychology of war and captivity. Life in an American prison camp was a shock for German POWs. They expected harsh treatment, but got ice cream and Coca-Cola instead. One POW, a young soldier named Hans, was captured in 1944. He was sent to a camp in Texas, where he met an American guard named Jack. Hans was amazed by the food in the camp. Every day he got 3 meals including meat, bread, and vegetables. But what really surprised him was the ice cream. It was a luxury he never had in Germany, where food was scarce. Hans and Jack became friends despite being on opposite sides of the war. Jack would often give Hans extra food including ice cream and Coca-Cola. Hans loved the sweet taste of the ice cream and the fizz of the Coca-Cola. He couldn't believe that his enemies were treating him so well. In Germany, POWs were often mistreated and underfed. But in America, Hans felt like he was living a comfortable life. The camp was like a small town with barracks, a mess hall, and even a library. Hans spent most of his time reading books and learning English. He was fascinated by the American culture and way of life. He would often ask Jack questions about America, and Jack would happily answer. Hans was surprised by the similarities between American and German culture. They both loved music, movies, and sports. But despite the comforts of the camp, Hans couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt. He was a prisoner, after all, and his country was at war with America. He felt like he was living a lie, enjoying the luxuries of his enemy while his fellow soldiers were fighting and dying on the front lines. Hans struggled with this moral dilemma, wondering if he was a traitor for enjoying his time in the camp. One day Jack took Hans to a nearby town where they watched a baseball game. Hans was amazed by the excitement of the crowd and the skill of the players. He loved the hot dogs and popcorn, and even tried to sing along to the American songs. For a moment he forgot that he was a prisoner and felt like he was part of the American community. Hans's experience in the camp taught him a valuable lesson. He realized that even in the midst of war, there is always humanity. The American guards, despite being his enemies, treated him with kindness and respect. They showed him that there was more to life than just war and hatred. Hans's story is a testament to the power of human connection, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. And it's this connection that can lead to unexpected friendships, like the one between Hans and Jack. This story of an unlikely friendship will lead us to the next part of our journey, where we'll explore how these friendships impacted the lives of German POWs after the war. So, what's really interesting is that the American prison camps during World War II weren't just about holding German soldiers captive. They were also about showcasing American culture and values. One way they did this was by providing the prisoners with small comforts like ice cream and Coca-Cola. This might sound strange, but it was a deliberate move to win the hearts and minds of the prisoners. The Americans wanted to show that their way of life was better, and that even in captivity, people could still enjoy simple pleasures. For the German soldiers, who had been living on meager rations and fighting a brutal war, these treats were a revelation. Take the story of a German prisoner named Hans. Hans had been a soldier on the front lines, fighting in some of the toughest battles of the war. When he was captured and brought to an American prison camp, he was exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. But one day as he was walking through the camp, he saw something that made his eyes widen in amazement, a machine that dispensed ice cream. Hans had never seen anything like it before. In Germany, ice cream was a rare luxury, and even then, it was usually just a simple mixture of milk and sugar. But this machine was churning out all sorts of flavors: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. Hans couldn't believe his eyes, and he couldn't wait to try some. The first bite was like a taste explosion in his mouth. The creamy texture, the sweet flavor, it was all so new and exciting. Hans felt like a kid in a candy store, trying flavor after flavor, and laughing with his fellow prisoners at the sheer joy of it all. For Hans, the ice cream was more than just a treat, it was a symbol of the freedom and abundance that America represented. He realized that the Americans weren't just trying to defeat the German army, they were trying to win the hearts and minds of the German people. And it was working. As Hans enjoyed his ice cream, he started to see the Americans in a different light. They weren't just the enemy, they were people who cared about the simple things in life, like enjoying a cold treat on a hot day. This realization was a key insight for Hans, and it changed the way he thought about the war and his place in it. The experience of Hans and other German prisoners like him shows that even in the midst of conflict, there is always the possibility for connection and understanding. And it's this idea that we'll explore further in the next section, where we'll look at how the American prison camps used education and re-education programs to help German prisoners adjust to life after the war. So, what's really interesting is how these small luxuries like ice cream and Coca-Cola affected the German POWs. One story that stands out is of a POW named Hans. Hans was a young soldier who had been captured in France and sent to a prison camp in the United States. At first, he was bitter and angry, feeling like he had been torn away from his family and friends. But as he settled into the camp, he started to notice the little things that made life more bearable. Like the fact that the American guards would sometimes share their cigarettes with the prisoners, or that the camp had a small library where they could borrow books. But what really caught Hans' attention was the ice cream truck that would come to the camp every week. The Americans would buy ice cream for the prisoners, and it was a huge treat. Hans had never had ice cream before, and the first time he tried it, he was amazed. It was like nothing he had ever tasted before. The cold, creamy texture and the sweet flavor were a revelation. From that day on, Hans looked forward to the ice cream truck every week. It was a small thing, but it gave him something to look forward to, a break from the monotony of camp life. As Hans settled into the routine of the camp, he started to realize that the Americans were not the monsters he had been led to believe. They were human beings with their own quirks and flaws, and they were treating the POWs with kindness and respect. The ice cream and Coca-Cola were just small symbols of that kindness. Hans started to see the Americans as individuals, rather than as enemies, and that changed everything. He started to learn English and even made friends with some of the guards. It was a strange and unexpected turn of events, but it was one that would stay with Hans for the rest of his life. The key insight here is that even in the midst of war and conflict, there is always the possibility for human connection and kindness. The ice cream and Coca-Cola may have seemed like small things, but they were a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the potential for generosity and compassion. And that's something that Hans never forgot, even after he was released from the camp and returned to Germany. He carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life, and it shaped the way he saw the world and the people in it. As we look at the story of Hans and the other German POWs, it's clear that the experience of being in an American prison camp was complex and multifaceted. It was a time of hardship and struggle, but also a time of unexpected kindness and connection. And it's this complexity that we'll explore further in the next section, where we'll look at the ways in which the POWs adapted to life in the camps, and the ways in which they found ways to survive and even thrive in the most challenging of circumstances. So, what's really interesting is that the American prison camps during World War II were not just about providing basic necessities like food and shelter. They were also about promoting a sense of normalcy and familiarity for the German POWs. One way they did this was by allowing the prisoners to participate in recreational activities like sports, music, and even newspaper production. For example, in a camp in Oklahoma, the prisoners were allowed to publish their own newspaper, which they called the Oklahoma Lager Zeitung. This newspaper was a huge hit among the prisoners, and it helped to boost their morale and provide a sense of connection to their homeland. The newspaper included articles about news from Germany, as well as stories about life in the camp. It even had a section for classified ads, where prisoners could buy and sell goods like cigarettes and clothing. But what's really fascinating is that the American authorities also allowed the prisoners to produce their own music and theater performances. In one camp in Texas, the prisoners formed a choir and even performed a production of The Merry Widow, a famous German opera. This was a huge hit among the prisoners, and it helped to bring a sense of joy and entertainment to their lives. Now, you might be wondering why the American authorities would allow the prisoners to engage in these kinds of activities. The answer is that they believed it would help to promote a sense of calm and stability in the camps, and reduce the risk of unrest and rebellion. By providing the prisoners with a sense of purpose and entertainment, they hoped to create a more peaceful and cooperative environment. This approach was actually pretty effective. Many of the German POWs who were held in American camps during World War II have spoken highly of their treatment and the opportunities they were given to engage in recreational activities. In fact, some of them have even said that their time in the camps was one of the most enjoyable periods of their lives. The key insight here is that the American authorities understood the importance of promoting a sense of normalcy and familiarity for the prisoners. By providing them with opportunities to engage in recreational activities, they were able to create a more positive and cooperative environment. This approach is still used today in prisons and detention centers around the world, and it's a great example of how a little bit of creativity and compassion can go a long way in promoting peace and stability. As we move on to the next part of our story, we're going to explore another fascinating aspect of life in the American prison camps during World War II, the role of education and training in helping the prisoners to prepare for life after the war. It's a really interesting topic, and it highlights the forward-thinking approach that the American authorities took in dealing with their prisoners. One German soldier, Hans, still remembers the day he arrived at an American prison camp. He was exhausted, hungry, and scared. But what he saw next changed everything. Inside the camp, there were rows of small huts, clean toilets, and even a small library. Hans couldn't believe it. He had expected to be treated poorly, but instead he was given a warm meal and a comfortable place to sleep. As Hans settled into the camp, he started to notice the little things that made life bearable. The American guards would often give them small treats like chocolate, cigarettes, and even ice cream. Hans had never tasted ice cream before, and it quickly became his favorite. He would often trade his cigarettes with other soldiers for an extra scoop. The Coca-Cola was another story altogether. Hans had heard of it but never tried it. The first sip was like nothing he had ever experienced. It was sweet, fizzy, and refreshing. But what really struck Hans was the kindness of the American guards. They would often talk to the prisoners, asking them about their lives, their families, and their hopes. Hans formed a bond with one guard in particular, a young man from Texas named Jack. Jack would often bring Hans small gifts like a newspaper or a book, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. Hans started to see the Americans in a different light. They weren't the enemy, they were just people like him trying to survive. As Hans looked around the camp, he realized that the Americans were trying to show them a different way of life. They were trying to show them that there was more to life than just war and hatred. The ice cream, the Coca-Cola, and the kindness of the guards were all part of a bigger plan. The Americans wanted to win the hearts and minds of their enemies, to show them that there was a better way to live. Hans's experience in the American prison camp was a turning point in his life. It made him question everything he had been taught, everything he had believed in. He started to see the world in a different light, to realize that there were always two sides to every story. And when he finally returned to Germany, he was a changed man. He would tell everyone he met about the kindness of the American guards, about the ice cream and the Coca-Cola, and about the lessons he learned in that prison camp. This story of Hans and his experience in the American prison camp is just one example of how the treatment of German POWs during World War II was different from what many people expect. The next section will explore more surprising facts about the living conditions and treatment of German POWs in American prison camps, and how these experiences affected the soldiers' lives after the war. One German POW, named Hans, still remembers his first taste of Coca-Cola in an American prison camp. He was 19 years old and had never seen a bottle of Coke before. The American guards handed out small bottles as a treat. Hans was curious, so he opened the bottle and took a sip. The sweet, fizzy taste surprised him. He had never tasted anything like it. Hans grew up in a small town in Germany, where soda was a luxury. His family couldn't afford it and he only drank water or beer. But Coca-Cola was different. He liked it and soon he was looking forward to the daily Coke ration. The American guards would often give them Coke and ice cream, which was a huge treat. Hans loved the combination of the cold, sweet ice cream and the fizzy Coke. The POWs would often talk about the food in the American camp. They were amazed by the variety and quality of the food. In German camps, food was scarce and POWs often went hungry. But in the American camp they got 3 meals a day and the food was delicious. Hans remembers eating pancakes with syrup, scrambled eggs and even steak. The food was so good that some POWs gained weight, which was unheard of in German camps. The American guards also gave the POWs access to entertainment. They had a library with books, magazines and even newspapers. Hans loved reading about American sports, especially baseball. He had never heard of the game before, but he found it fascinating. The guards also showed them movies, which was a luxury the POWs had never experienced before. Hans's experience in the American prison camp was eye-opening. He realized that the Americans were not the monsters he had been told about. They were kind, generous and fair. The guards treated the POWs with respect, and they even became friends with some of them. Hans learned that there was more to the Americans than what he had seen in propaganda movies. The treatment of German POWs in American camps was a significant aspect of the war. It showed that even in the midst of conflict, there was room for kindness and compassion. The Americans could have treated the POWs poorly, but they chose not to. Instead, they gave them good food, entertainment, and even luxuries like Coca-Cola. Hans's story is just one example of the many German POWs who experienced the kindness of American guards. Their stories are a testament to the human spirit, which can overcome even the darkest of times. As we move on to the next part of our story, we'll explore how the experience of German POWs in American camps affected their lives after the war. What happened to Hans and the other POWs when they returned to Germany? How did their experience in the American camp shape their views of the world? We'll find out in the next section. So, what's really interesting is that some German POWs actually stayed in the United States after the war. They had grown to love the country and its people despite being prisoners. One such person was a man named George. George was a young soldier when he was captured by American forces. He was taken to a prison camp in Texas, where he was treated relatively well. He was given food, shelter, and even allowed to work on a local farm. George was amazed by the kindness of the American people. He had been told that Americans were cruel and heartless, but his experience was the opposite. He formed close bonds with the farmers he worked for, and they taught him how to speak English. George was a quick learner and soon he was fluent in the language. He also learned about American culture, including music, movies, and sports. After the war, George was given the option to return to Germany, but he decided to stay in the United States. He had fallen in love with the country and its people, and he wanted to start a new life. He became a citizen, got a job, and even started a family. George's story is just one example of how the experience of being a POW in an American prison camp could be a positive one. It's also worth noting that some German POWs were able to learn new skills while in the prison camps. Many were taught English, and some even learned trades like carpentry or mechanics. This was a deliberate effort by the American authorities, who wanted to help the prisoners become productive members of society after the war. It's a testament to the forward thinking of the American government at the time. The story of George and other German POWs who stayed in the United States after the war is a fascinating one. It shows that even in the midst of conflict, there can be moments of kindness and compassion. And it highlights the importance of treating prisoners with dignity and respect, regardless of their nationality or background. As we look back on this period in history, it's clear that the experience of German POWs in American prison camps was complex and multifaceted. There were certainly challenges and difficulties, but there were also moments of kindness and connection. And for some, like George, the experience was truly life-changing. Now, let's take a closer look at how the American government's treatment of German POWs during World War II compares to the treatment of POWs in other conflicts. This will give us a better understanding of the significance of the American approach and how it has influenced international norms and standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. In the end, what's striking about the experiences of German POWs in American prison camps is the profound cultural shock they underwent. The abundance of food, the availability of luxuries like ice cream and Coca-Cola, and the humane treatment they received were a far cry from what they had expected. This unexpected generosity had a profound impact on their perspective, challenging their preconceived notions about their enemies and the world beyond their borders. As we reflect on these stories, it's hard not to undergo a personal transformation ourselves. The realization that even in the midst of conflict, there can be moments of kindness, compassion, and understanding is a powerful one. It challenges us to re-examine our own biases and prejudices, and to consider the humanity that exists in those we may have previously seen as enemies. One thing we can do right now is to seek out stories and experiences that challenge our own worldview. By engaging with the perspectives of others, especially those who may have been marginalized or misunderstood, we can broaden our understanding of the world and gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human experience. This video found you for a reason. Perhaps you're someone who is curious about the human side of history, or maybe you're looking for a reminder that even in difficult times, there is always the potential for kindness and compassion. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful that you're here, and I hope that this story has inspired you to think differently about the world and your place in it. If you liked this video, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps me to continue sharing stories that inspire and transform. And as you go about your day, remember that the power to change our perspective, to challenge our assumptions, and to choose kindness and compassion is always within our grasp. The stories of these German POWs serve as a testament to the human capacity for resilience, adaptability, and transformation, and I hope that they will stay with you long after this video is over, inspiring you to approach the world with a sense of wonder, curiosity, and empathy.